This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Gail Henriksen. I'm the Community Development Director for Clatsop County, and I would like to thank you for taking time this morning to come to our second public town hall meeting to provide input and discussion about the proposed temporary short-term rental moratorium. We did have a meeting last Friday as well, and we're going to be following the same basic format. Before we get started, though, first of all, I'd like to introduce Vice Chair and Commissioner Leanne Thompson. She is the representative from District 5. And Commissioner Thompson, would you like to address the group?
Oh, just very briefly, thank you. Thank you, Gail. Thank you all the neighbors who wanted to come and be heard this morning. I see Commissioner Toyoka is on the call, my colleague on the County Board of Commissioners. There are, for those of you who may not know, 5 county commissioners in Clatsop County. Together, we constitute the governing body. Each one of us represents approximately 20% of the population in order to have one person, one vote. District 5, which we're part of, is the southern half of Seaside, goes up into Fishhawk Lake and Mist, all the way to the Columbia County line, all the way down to the Tillamook County line to the ocean. So it's over half the land mass in Clatsop County. And that's the jurisdiction of District 5 in Clatsop County. There are cities within it. The county deals with rural issues. So that's the framework, the context. This morning, I've been thinking, listening to neighbors is always interesting. It's part of the joy and the challenge of the job I have as a county commissioner. Looking at all the emails, listening to what people have to say, both in person and through telephone calls, I think there are a couple of different toolkits we can access as we do this community work together. We can have a toolbox that has anger and contempt, or we can access the toolbox that is compassionate and tells truth with kindness, so that what we're looking at is how can we collaborate together in the most constructive, most effective way. Because it's natural for human beings to have differences. Living in this part of rural Clatsop County, we face a variety of natural hazards. And when push comes to shove, it isn't just the quality of day-to-day life, it's how will we be able to help each other when bad things happen, windstorms, tsunamis, earthquakes, wildfires, all of those challenges that Mother Nature is going to throw at us. So together, accessing kindness, compassion, data-supported conclusions, I hope we can build a happier and more effective community. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Thompson. And we also have Commissioner John Toyuka, who is a district representative from District 2. And Commissioner, would you like to say a few words to the group? And you are not on mute, but we are not hearing you. I think Commissioner Banks had the same problem last time. Okay, we will come back to you and hopefully get to hear from you in just a few minutes. Okay, so before we go right into the agenda, I just wanted to give a few tips on how to use GoToMeeting in case people are not familiar with it. I do have everyone on mute right now, and while you're not speaking, if you could please continue to keep your phones and your microphones on mute, because that just helps everyone to hear more clearly and cuts down on the interference as we talk. If you are on a phone, you can mute and unmute yourself by using *6, and that will take your phone off mute and then put it back on mute. Throughout the meeting, I'll be monitoring the chat box, which is the little speech bubble that's highlighted up here in the yellow circle, and you should see that on your GoToMeeting screen. You'll be able to type a question in down here and hit enter, and that will go out to the group. And I'm a one-person show today, so I'll be trying to talk and monitor and listen at the same time. So be patient with me as I continue to check the chat box as we go forward. So the reason, let me go first of all over our agenda and what we're going to be talking about today. In a little bit, I'm going to give a brief overview of why we're here, how we got here, and where we're looking to go moving forward. Then we're going to do the written and public comment. And for those of you who are at last week's meeting, we'll do a little bit different format, so you don't have to listen to me for 40 minutes. We'll alternate between written and in-person comments and just go back and forth until we get through all the comments. And then we'll review the next steps and upcoming meeting dates that we have going forward on the moratorium. And then hopefully around 12:30, we will complete our business and adjourn for the day. So a little bit of background. So we have had a lot of discussions about short-term rentals over the years, and back in 2020, staff started doing quarterly discussions starting in the Falcon Cove Beach area, and then we added in Arch Cape and finally Clatsop Plains area. And we heard a lot of comments and input from a variety of people on the subject. And after we had heard a lot of that for about 6 or 8 months, we went forward to the board in February of this year to talk about some possible revisions to the short-term rental ordinance. One thing that people may not be aware of is that Clatsop County has 2 short-term rental ordinances. We have one that is specifically for Arch Cape, and that's been in place since 2003. And then we have an ordinance that covers the rest of the unincorporated areas, and that was adopted in January of 2018. So staff wanted to talk to the board about making some revisions to make the ordinance clearer, help people understand how the enforcement process works, and find ways that we could make the ordinance itself just more enforceable and help us do our job and help you as you work together to balance the short-term rental and long-term residents in a community. So on February 24th, we went to the board in a work session and got some direction from them. We made some additional revisions and brought those back to the board on April 20th. And in that time between February and April 20th, sort of like today, the board received a lot of input from community members, and it was on all sides of the short-term rental issue. So at that time, the board asked staff to take a step back and just pause what we were working on right now, and just to have some additional discussion and time to review all the comments that had come in. So we went back again to the board in June of this year, and at that time, the board directed staff to start working on a temporary moratorium. And so we are doing that at the request of the board, and we also made a commitment to the board that we would go for public comment before we brought any moratorium ordinance to them. So that's why we're having these meetings. We had one last week, and this is our second one. And so we'll have 2 town halls on this before any discussion with the board begins in August. One other thing to be aware of is that under state statute, when a community considers a moratorium, they are required to provide notice to the Department of Land Conservation and Development, which is DLCD, at least 45 days prior to the first public hearing on that moratorium. So our first scheduled public hearing is tentatively August 11th. And so in order to meet our 45-day deadline, we did submit that required notice to the state on June 4th. And if you go to the county's website where our meeting materials are for today, you'll see a copy of that notice that was sent to DLCD. So that was kind of a lot of information. I'm going to pause briefly and just see, did anyone have any questions about the background? before we move on? Caller 4, I see you came off mute. Did you have a question? I'm going to take that as a no. Okay. So just to give an overview of the moratorium ordinance that's in draft form right now, it's going to be Ordinance 2103. And as I stated, it's going to apply to all the areas of unincorporated Clatsop County, which would include Falcon Cove Beach, Arch Cape, Swenson, Napa, Westport, Elsie, Jewel, and everywhere in between. It's also going to apply within the urban growth boundary of the city of Gerhardt. And that's a little bit unusual. And the reason for that is when the city of Gerhardt went through its short-term rental regulation process, the areas that are one day going to be part of Gerhardt but are not quite annexed into the city yet, they're in that urban growth boundary that surrounds Gerhardt. Those residents didn't want to be part of Gerhardt short-term rental regulations, and so Gerhardt said to the county that we would go ahead and take responsibility for those. So any other city or urban growth boundary within the county, this ordinance does not apply to those areas. And also per state statute, we had initially as staff looked at a 6-month temporary moratorium, but because of the way the statute is written and because some of the lands that will be covered by this ordinance are considered urban or urbanizable, and that would include that urban growth boundary of Gerhardt, we can only start out with a 120-day moratorium. And the board does have the option to extend beyond those 120 days, but we do have to go back to the state and give them at least a 14-day notice that we would consider doing that. So initially, we don't intend to have the moratorium in place for more than 6 months, but we will start out with the 4-month moratorium, which may be extended to 6 months. During the time that the moratorium is in place, the following items would happen. The county would no longer issue any new short-term rental permits. We wouldn't accept any new applications or process any new applications. This would also apply to the transfer of existing short-term rental permits, and those would be suspended during the moratorium as well. The only exception that would occur is if you did have an application that had been submitted on or before the time the moratorium is adopted. And right now that's tentatively scheduled for August 25th of this year. So if your permit is in the process and in the queue, we would continue to process it. But then afterwards, we would not accept any more applications. If the ordinance is adopted as currently drafted, it would take effect on September 1st of this year. And then the 120-day period would end December 29th, unless the board were to extend that for another 2 months or a time period that they felt was appropriate to complete our work. So that is the draft ordinance. I'm going to stop again and see if anybody has any information before we move on to, or questions before we move on to public comment.
Hello there. Quick question is, this is only about new applications. So renewals would be processed in this moratorium phase?
Actually, nobody should be renewing during the moratorium phase. When the Ordinance 1801 was adopted that applied to all the rest of the incorporated area outside of Arch Cape, we transferred all short-term rentals to a 5-year permit, including the ones in Arch Cape. So in 2018, everybody would have applied for a permit and it's good for 5 years. So we would not have any renewals coming up until 2023 at the earliest.
Okay, so thus this will not deal with that. I'm trying to look forward and see if this gets extended and maybe renewed, what happens when we come to that point. And so we're not getting there yet. Okay.
Right. Well, I can't speak for the board. What would happen is we would have to extend the moratorium basically until July of 2023, which would be almost a 2-year moratorium. state statute and general practice is your moratorium period is required to be the smallest that you need to accomplish the identified tasks that you sent out.
Okay.
I think a 2-year moratorium would be pushing the boundaries with the state and probably with state statute. And, you know, if for some reason, you know, we had a moratorium in place that long, then at that point we would need to go back to the board and get direction about how they would want to handle renewals.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Could
Okay,
I ask that callers identify themselves if they have their camera off, just so we can know who's on the call? It would just help me, please. And there's a comment in the chat box, Gail.
yeah, so our question asker was Justin Hawkwood, according to the information on his ID box. We have a question from Claire Hazler Lewis. What constitutes the urban growth boundary of Gerhardt? And I can show you that if you will bear with me for a moment while I pull up a map. The purple areas here that are labeled GGB, that's the urban growth boundary. So let me pull back a little bit here. And you can see that here's Gerhardt. There's a little bit on the east side of 101, and then there's this larger area that is along the ocean front just south of Highlands Avenue. And then there's a little bit down here as you get closer to Seaside. So that's the urban growth boundary around Gerhardt. Most of our short-term rentals in that area are in this area along the beach. Okay. So if there are no more questions, we will go ahead and get into our public comment period. So as I said, we'll alternate back and forth between written and public comments, and I will start with the written comments. The first one is from the Falcon Cove Beach residents, and they have submitted a good neighbor agreement that has been signed by several residents in the community and property owners. And the good neighbor agreement states the following. The following principles and agreements have been created by residents of Falcon Cove Beach in order to cultivate a community of good neighbors. Good neighbor principles. Number 1, transparency. Commitment to cultivate an environment of transparency and work with our neighbors to find solutions to issues as a community. Number 2, non-discrimination. Cultivate an environment of non-discrimination that welcomes all. Number 3, mutual respect. Commitment to hearing neighbor concerns with a willingness to understand and come up with creative solutions as a community. Good neighbor agreements and projects. Number 1, communicate and share best practices concerning Clatsop County ordinances and short-term rental ordinances regarding noise, lighting, parking, and safety. Number 2, develop and share best practices for responsible garbage management. Number 3, participate in the efficient use of our community's water resources and preservation of our watershed. Number 4, develop publicly available resources with ocean safety information. Number 5, develop and share best practices regarding COVID safety to keep our community safe. It is our sincere hope that the above guiding principles and agreements will foster an environment of mutual respect in our community, both with one another and with the nature that surrounds us. We invite all of the community to participate and continue to evolve this list of shared values for our community. And then there are probably about 40 signatures on there. Okay, next we will hear from Jim and Kathy May. Are they on the line? And if you are on the phone, you'll need to hit *6 to unmute yourself. Okay, I do not see or hear them, so we'll move on. Is Alan Solaris here?
Yes, I am.
Okay,
Okay.
go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay. So I want to get to the specifics of the items that are proposed for regulations that the group of us have previously submitted testimony, about a dozen of us. But just to clarify on some of the issues, I think one of the real questions is, how bad is this situation, and what degree of oversight or regulation is needed beyond what currently exists. There's a really vocal and activist core group that has really generated this, and I know that was true back in the Arch Cape days. That really kind of takes people to push forward the idea to examine these issues, and they take on a momentum of their own. But as you've heard in other testimony, it's really important for the commission to realize that many of the complaints coming out of Falcon Cove and Cove Beach are generated by just a couple of individuals, and many of those are exaggerated. There's even video testimony that's been submitted to you that kind of gives a play-by-play that compares the complaint with the actual situation. So that's worth taking a look at as an example. But we know that short-term rentals have an impact. We know that neighbors do, and have many of the same activities of, parties and reunions and weddings and friends coming and staying and so on. And they have impacts not unlike those of short-term rentals. But regardless of that, we're not talking about regulating normal neighborly occurrences, but we're talking about short-term rentals, and I think the owners have pretty much accepted that we have a special responsibility in that regard, and think that the permitting system that's already in place and the regulations are actually very reasonable and they're based largely on health and safety, but also on some lifestyle concerns. And we also accept that the system needs improvement. So we're just asking for a middle ground that's somewhere between the idea of banning or capping or limiting the geographic areas where they can occur, instead looking at what kinds of requirements will assure that we are good neighbors to the rest of the folks in our area. So specifically, and I've submitted this previously, but to reiterate these things, we oppose the 2-year renewal fee. It's much too frequent. It's currently 5 years. We would support having every 4 years, and that happens to coincide with one of the concerns is about septics, and DEQ doesn't require but recommends that septics are evaluated every 4 years, and this could be hand in hand with utilizing that as a requirement for STRs. And also having to do this every 2 years, it's duplicative. There's not really much change in a year or two on the things that are being required to be checked. So it's a bigger staff workload. It's excessive cost to both the staff and to the owners to have to pay for it. We also support the idea that the initial fee for a permit requires extra administrative and staff time that is not true on most renewals, so that perhaps the renewals would be at a lower rate, say $300 rather than $550. As far as transferring permits and fees, we think that's reasonable to assume that the fee can be transferred, but to require the new owner to identify themselves and submit documentation that they are aware of and are continuing to follow the requirements that have already been imposed, and that they're aware of the ordinance. And then they'll come up on their regular renewal time period so that the county can then take a look at them. The hotline was proposed to have a 20-minute response time by the owner. I just think it's just unrealistic to make phone calls, explain situations, and expect a response immediately. But right now, the current language already provides for a prompt response and a reasonable effort to remedy the situation. I think that gives some flexibility to the staff and would not oppose the imposition of a timed response, more on the order of 60 minutes rather than 20, but also retain the language that exists so that staff has the ability to look at, the situation and see, okay, these folks, are going to call back, or they're, other reasons why the 20 minutes might not occur, but they're not automatically, the owner isn't automatically penalized to the contact person for the 20-minute or 60-minute. Complaint substantiation, we're really concerned about specious and really kind of aggressive stances that have been taken by some of the owners. And so we're really concerned with being able to provide documentation. There is, if available, the proposed language is, if available, that video or photographs be provided. I think there's certain kind of complaints like garbage, parking in the wrong places, or too many cars, that can easily be documented and really should be expected and really required for those types of complaints. Complaints also should be signed. I think that would help to avoid spurious complaints. And I think also requiring just having a statement at the end that the complainant swears to the accuracy and validity of the complaint. And that be a disincentive then to vexatious complaints. Sometimes these complaints are coming even from unaffected parties or on behalf of others who aren't even present, or they're based on hearsay. So we propose that complainants sign a statement, testify to the truthfulness, and that the complaint needs to actually affect the complaining party, not be based on someone else or hearsay. Let me just go to this other deal here. Hang on. And I will submit written testimony on this, so I'll refer to the specific sections. And I have a couple of more here to go over. 120B deletes the mandatory revocation of permits after 3 violations and replaces it with 3 levels of investigatory priorities. And it takes into account a variety of factors like severity, but it doesn't appear to consider the violation's frequency, mitigating circumstances, the owner's response to remedy the situation, and it even includes some non-STR related violations that shouldn't even be in the ordinance. So we support the revocation of the 3 strikes rule, but propose remaining the non-STR violations and allowing for more judgment rather than just based on the number of complaints. 120C is, well, I think basically the same comments with regard to that. 120J authorizes penalties for persons submitting false or unsubstantiated complaints. It refers to an ORS section of the law, which deals with forgery and fraud. I'm not sure how well that's going to work in the STR context, but it's very important to have the ability to deter, to respond, and to penalize vexatious complainers. So you may need to use new or other existing authorities. So we propose, this is the last part here, to prohibit persons who make unsubstantiated complaints. They need to provide some kind of evidence, and especially to be able for the county to be able to deal with prolific complainers. And other jurisdictions have rules where somebody who submits false or unsubstantiated complaints multiple times, usually 3, are actually then prohibited or ignored as far as future complaints go. They're just recognized as creating problems. So that's my testimony, and I will submit this in written form subsequently.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Solaris. And all of the comments that are written are posted on the county's website, and so as we get additional comments, we'll post those as well.
Thank you.
Our next comment is a written comment from Jonathan and Margie Felix Lund. They write, "There are many issues in front of us worthy of investigation so we can discover what story the evidence tells. The issue I'd like to call to your attention in this letter is false complaints. I'd like to suggest that the board interview the county enforcement team in an effort to ask thoughtful questions and help form your understanding of the issues and complaints that brought us to this place. Please consider interviewing members of this team to help establish the scope of the issue from those managing these complaints on the ground. Valuable time and county resources meant for safety compliance are being wasted due to false complaints and complaints not covered by the ordinance. I've dealt with and documented evidence disproving the following false complaints. First is noise complaints. While staying at my home, a false complaint was sent in claiming my dogs have been barking since 6 a.m. I have a decibel reader in my home and external video evidence showing otherwise. There was some barking at 9 a.m., which was exaggerated and reported erroneously. Next is trash complaints. Photo evidence has been sent in claiming and simultaneously disproving that we were in violation of the STR ordinance because the bin lid was slightly ajar by about 1 inch from being full. This has been attempted twice in an effort to get marks against our permit. 3. Aggressive guest complaint. There was a recent complaint suggesting our guests were being aggressive and yelling at a neighbor. The video evidence actually shows the neighbor yelling and acting aggressively towards our non-aggressive guests. This antagonistic behavior is, unfortunately, a pattern. My first encounter with this neighbor involved being screamed at while viewing the property I was in contract to purchase. 4. Parking complaint. My neighbor sent in a photo of a car pulling into the driveway of our home, claiming that they were blocking the road and citing a safety hazard. Video evidence undeniably shows the car was occupied and moving in and out of the driveway in the span of 1 minute. The evidence in this situation so clearly points to fabrication with intent to harm that it demands the attention of the board as you consider good policy concerning short-term rental regulations. My home, and specifically my one neighbor, make up the majority of all complaints in our neighborhood. This is very telling information and should provide scope to the issue we are dealing with. Why is it the case that nearly all complaints come from a few predictable parties against a few predictable homes in one neighborhood? Some would like you to believe our family represents an irresponsible, absent business tycoon, but anyone who has engaged us knows how silly that is and how earnestly we have tried to engage this issue with a creative, solution-oriented mindset. I'm asking that the board looks into these complaints in detail. I think you will find concerns that seem very reasonable on the surface, while the detailed evidence exposes unethical behavior and points to harmful intentions. All kinds of fallacious, fabricated, and exaggerated accusations have been made against our property, either in the form of complaints, public testimony, or rumor spreading. I've researched each concern in detail, and it's incredibly clear that some specific residents are not interested in compromise, but are attempting to weaponize the ordinance against families like mine. The county should be focused on health and safety as it concerns short-term stays. I propose that punitive action should be reserved for those that refuse to comply and collaborate with the county enforcement team. Opponents of short-term rentals would like the equivalent of mandatory minimum sentencing so it can be weaponized against permit holders based on complaints, not violations. As permit holders, we are not attempting to shun regulation and collaboration. We are asking the board to pursue a thoughtful policy that prioritizes safety and guards against weaponization. Please consider some of the following facts, knowing that our house has received a majority of the complaints, not violations, in our neighborhood. 1. In the last year, our average occupancy was 4.8 guests per stay for a 3-bedroom, 2.5 bathroom, 2,100 square foot home. Over the last year, we used an average of 103 gallons of water per day. The max reading was 197 gallons per day. Our septic system is rated for 400 gallons a day. Most of the guests that stay at our home are families with young children like ours. They are seeking access with their children to Oregon's public beaches. We have been responsive, compliant, and open to problem solving with both the county and our neighbors. Despite this, we've been consistently targeted with false complaints from one neighbor. We support sensible policies that encourage neighbors to work together. There are deeply held personal biases on either side, so we need the county to support all property owners with fair, balanced, and lawful policies. Despite the stress and frustration these false complaints have caused, you will still find us completely committed to win-win solutions for our neighborhood. We are in support of a temporary moratorium so long as it gets us closer to a fair solution and is not drawn out without justification like the water moratorium. We do not support a moratorium on transfers, as this could cause undue hardship for some without aiding the intent of pausing permit growth. Should this moratorium be approved, we think the top complaining parties with clearly vested interests should not be permitted on any potential task force. Thank you. All right, next we will hear from Vivian Simon Brown.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm a part-time resident at Falcon Cove Beach, and I'm representing the Friends of Falcon Cove Beach. Our intent is to work cooperatively to enhance the livability and protect the natural environment of the cove. We support the moratorium on new short-term rental applications and really are looking forward to working with the county and our neighbors in crafting improved ordinances. At last month's work session, Commissioner Webb brought up an excellent point about carrying capacity. I'd like to build on that concept. I'm a biologist, so this biological concept helps us look at the bigger picture, bigger than the ordinances, something we need to keep in our minds. The most straightforward definition of carrying capacity is that it's the number of people or other living organisms that a region can support without environmental degradation. So what's involved in the carrying capacity of Falcon Cove Beach? Well, first we have to identify our geographic boundaries. On the north is Arch Cape and the new Rainforest Reserve, thanks to many people, including our own Commissioner Thompson for that. East and south is Oswald West State Park. On the west, besides the obvious Pacific Ocean, is the Cape Falcon Marine Reserve. Our community is bounded on 4 sides by mostly untouched natural environment. We're truly nestled between the forest and the sea, and as the short-term rental ads say, it's a hidden oasis. Our access to the outside world is Highway 101, which bisects our area north and south, though as many of us have experienced, storms, landslides can close the highway at both the tunnel and Neocony Mountain, leaving us truly isolated. We also, to complicate everything, have 2 counties, Tillamook and Clatsop, that adds a difficulty with administration. So environmentally, our carrying capacity wasn't a consideration when the area was platted originally. It was about 200 lots that were jammed in without consideration of streams, wildlife corridors, geologic hazards, or tsunami zones. No one wondered about the impact of sewage on unconsolidated sand, silt, and mud soils, which are underlain by impervious clay. One magnificent and ever-flowing artesian spring was expected to provide water for everyone and has done an amazing job throughout the years. We started out with about 15 residents and 5 houses. Remained that way for quite a while, but now we have about 95 houses with 26 full-time residents, about 200 part-time residents, and approximately 21,000 customers per year from the short-term rentals. So that means we also have to look at social carrying capacity besides environmental carrying capacity. What does a community need to be sustainable? First of all, visitors are welcome. We've always had visitors to the Cove. We welcome them. However, we also need to have a stable population, people we can rely on, people who work on school boards, water districts, or other nonprofits. We need teachers who live in the area to teach our kids. We need emergency volunteers who have chainsaws and know how to use them to clear the roads that are blocked by downed trees, or people who have generators when the power goes out, or who maintain emergency caches for when the hurricanes, the earthquakes, and the tsunamis hit. So environmental capacity and social capacity, but now we also need economic capacity. We need enough money to keep our community viable. And this is where the short-term owners can say, of course, aha, this is where we come in. Yes, short-term rental owners make money. However, the money doesn't often come to our community. The cleaners, the greeters, the yard maintenance people don't live in the community, so they can't afford to live in the community. The money goes to short-term rental owners and to the county. And currently, the short-term rental transient occupancy taxes really don't directly benefit our community. Commissioner Thompson knows that that needs to be changed and is working vigorously to make that happen. So if carrying capacity is the number of people or other living organisms that a region can support without environmental degradation, we really need to consider those 3 things when we're looking at our ordinances. We really need to remember the bigger picture. Let me quickly end with an analogy, a way to remember sustainable carrying capacity. It's officially called the nested sustainability model. You can look it up. However, I call it the Elmer's pancake model. Imagine you're in an Elmer's restaurant for breakfast. You order their pancake special. It shows up on a very large platter. The platter represents our environmental or our geographic boundaries. Its carrying capacity encompasses, supports, and limits what goes on inside. Inside this large platter is a huge pancake. The pancake size, our community, is obviously limited by the platter or the geographic size. Put too much syrup on that pancake and it slops over. It makes a mess. It messes up everything. So we have to avoid that. And finally, what really makes the Elmer's special is that there's a fried egg on top. Obviously, it's smaller. It's the economic aspect of carrying capacity. It's dependent on the size of the community, which is dependent on the carrying capacity of our natural systems and our geographic area. In our case, it's the very small piece of land between the forest and the sea. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vivian. Next is a written comment from John and Maria Meyer. As homeowners in Cove Beach and short-term rental permit holders, we have 3 recommendations to clarify the proposed moratorium on new short-term rental permits. To avoid restricting property rights of current property owners, 1, the moratorium should not apply to any property owners of record as of the date the moratorium becomes effective. In other words, a current property owner of record could still apply for a new permit during the moratorium. Number 2, The moratorium should clearly state it is not the intent of the moratorium to adversely affect or limit any existing property rights that exist today, including the right of current permit holders to transfer the permit with a property sale. This both establishes the intent and purpose of the moratorium, as well as ensures the moratorium does not affect current property rights. If, for instance, a permit were expiring and needed to be renewed during the moratorium period, the county would not delay or hinder approval or somehow classify it as a new permit. Normal routine protocols for permits would apply. To be clear, the moratorium would not apply to permit renewals. Number 3, we understand the moratorium applies only to new applications for rental permits on properties that do not currently have a valid permit issued and would be subject to the clarifications in number 1 and number 2 above. The suggestions above are to add clarity to the proposed moratorium should it be approved and protect property rights. We appreciate your consideration of each recommendation. And then next we'll hear from Joanne Cornelius.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank you, commissioners, and for listening to my thanks and concerns for on Wednesday meeting for a couple of minutes. To start with, it seems that those who live in towns in this county have much better protection for their citizens and voters than those of us in unincorporated communities. It makes one want to consider incorporation, which is not what we in Falcon Cove Beach have ever wanted. Note the surveys taken by Clatsop County in 1975 and the spring of 1978 at the beginning of creating the comprehensive plan when asking members of Arch Cape what the community should be. That's on page 44 of 53. Cove Beach had one responder to a survey and 3 to the other. Letters seem to have been sent to Arch Cape. Since the development of Arch Cape's wastewater system, after its moratorium was lifted, development has resumed at a much faster pace, regardless of road improvements. If only surveys were taken in our unincorporated community, which does not have any commercial zoning. Cove Beach is an entirely different community. No commercial zoning, no wastewater disposal system like Arch Cape. The health of our community relies on the county and DEQ for approval of septic systems. The Southwest Coastal Comprehensive Plan encouraged vacating or replatting old subdivisions in 1979. See the letter from Jack Pace. Clatsop County decided to make exceptions for lots of record, so size of lots for septic permits can be anywhere from 10,000 square feet to whatever DEQ decides. When one has test holes dug to apply for septic systems or permits, it's important to do it late in summer or fall before the heavy rain so that the test holes are dry when inspected by DEQ. Is DEQ aware of the water table in spring and where the outfall from overfilled drain fields goes? If and when one needs their septic tank pumped or holding tanks pumped, there's the fact that there are 4 companies in the county that do this. And then because of overfilled city sewer systems and no county sewer systems, they have to travel to Rainier or Tillamook to dump. On top of that, the places they go to dump can limit the amount they can dump because of their systems on being overfilled at any time of the year. Last year, Tillamook was closed because of forest fires. So the more houses with septic systems in small unincorporated communities with clay soil, no space or funding for wastewater systems, residents living on fixed incomes and no interest in becoming a city are forced by county planning to overextend the carrying capacity of their community when the county approves STRs. STR rules for Cove Beach do not consider the relationship of the amount of people using those rentals to the amount of water used and size of septic tanks in those STRs. There are septic tanks that have not been pumped in 20 years that are not connected to sewer systems because of grandfathering. Once permitted, never inspected again. Maybe when homes change hands, but then realtors have been known to influence pumpers to pass inspections. Does DEQ keep records of inspected systems, and does Clatsop County follow up on those that fail? My question to the Clatsop County Commissioners who have the responsibility to listen to their citizens: have you all read the Southwest Coastal Comprehensive Plan of June 1, 1979? Hopefully, at least the representative from this area has. That plan is being worked on right now to be revised, as all in this area should be aware. Goal 1 of the 19 goals is the most important goal, which is citizen involvement. And I will tell you a story about the history of this plan. Those citizens who were involved in developing this plan were members of the Arch Cape Citizens Advisory Committee, which had no members from Cove Beach. No advertising at the local post office mentioned Cove Beach, so we weren't aware of planning for our community. Falcon Cove Beach Water District is only mentioned once, page 21, in the Southwest Coastal Comprehensive Plan, and that has to do with our water district. When it was noticed that planning was going on in South Clatsop County, we started asking questions and discovered that Arch Cape was making plans for Cove Beach without any involvement from those of us who lived in the area. Thus, the letter from our water district to the Arch Cape CAC of 10/12/78, read before the County Planning Commission at the Catholic Church in Arch Cape by me, at that point, attending members of the CAC, the Arch Cape Citizens Advisory Committee, members being a realtor, a rancher from Pendleton, and a recent citizen from California, walked out of the meeting. From then on, the Arch Cape CAC became known as Southwest Coastal CAC. One of the Falcon Cove Beach District's recommendations in that letter was that Clatsop County take into consideration the special problems of our community and include a subset of policies tailored to our needs, to the same extent that Arch Cape policies have been developed by that area's citizens. Cove Beach had not been mentioned at all, and if you notice in the plan, we're barely there. And we, among smaller unincorporated areas, are mostly left out. In Cove Beach's case, Goal 1 was not followed by Clatsop County or Arch Cape. As I said before, Cove Beach is a different community, even though we share a postal code. Also note that in the appendices to the South Coastal Comprehensive Plan, there are letters from Clatsop County Sanitarian Ray Franklin and John Pace via the Clatsop County Planning Department, from the Oregon Water Resources Department regarding the status of suitability for septic approvals in the Cove Beach area. Nothing has changed in Cove Beach except more houses have been built and are continuing, and a very large percentage of those are not STRs or applying for permits to be STRs. I wonder if any of the commissioners are owners of an STR or planning on becoming an owner. Others have said all of this much better, but I have been there. Thank you for listening, and please vote on the moratorium and include members of Cove Beach on a task force to refine rules for SCRs that are here now. Please read the Southwest County Comprehensive Plan and think of Cove Beach. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cornelius. Next, we have written comments from Susan Paduano. And she writes, "Thank you very much for your consideration of written submissions. I appreciate the opportunity to share my viewpoint regarding the possible moratorium and short-term rental permits. My husband Paul and I purchased our home in Cove Beach in 2014. In the fairly short period of time since, our small area has experienced a water shortage and an increased number of rentals. The percentage of homes that have become short-term rentals is now 30%, an alarmingly high percentage. I will admit that I used to not be impacted by the influx of short-term rentals. There wasn't a rental near to our home, and I had not experienced the issues that come along with the turnovers that rentals create. Now the house directly across the street is a rental with high turnover, and there are two just one house away. I now experience the turmoil that comes with this issue not being enforced and limited. For the record, I would like to note the lowlights of the issues that we have dealt with from just the rental across the street. Renters do not treat our neighborhood as they would their own. We experience very loud noises late at night. One group was using the yard next door to the house as a baseball field, and I informed them that they were not on the property they had rented. And recently a renter had brought a portable fire pit and had a tall flaming fire on the upper wooden deck. I emailed the owners, who responded immediately, contacted the renters, and then thanked me for keeping an eye out. But the truth of the matter is that I do not need to keep an eye out because these instances are impactful. We are in a drought, surrounded by forests, and the tall flames from the outdoor pit are simply dangerous. During the last 2 summers, when there was a water moratorium because of a well issue in our neighborhood, we were not to use outside water. During this time, I watched as the rental across the street sometimes turned over 3 times in 1 week. That is 3 cleanings, 3 groups of people running laundry, using the hose outside to wash their cars, etc. We are directly impacted when the renters across the street leave lights on at all hours of the night because they shine across the street into our bedroom. When extra cars are using our roads, when they leave the garbage unsecured and trash ends up in the road. We are impacted because we cannot depend on any regulations that keep our peace in mind or help to secure the investment we have all made in our neighborhood. We do not need to consider how we would describe correct behavior. We know it, we live it. We do not rent out our home. That really is the nail on the head. This is our home. We live in Boise, Idaho, but this is our home in all the ways that it counts. We have our precious belongings there. We bought with an eye to our future, and we consider and treat the area as our home. We know our neighbors and support them when they need help. We know who is sick, who needs a ride, and this is a circular relationship because we are neighbors in a neighborhood. Paul and I, as non-Oregonians, pay taxes in Clatsop County but cannot vote in the county. We depend on you to do the right thing by us, to create limitations on rentals, to put a cap on the percentage of rentals, to take our quality of life into account. Many areas and cities have tackled this issue. There are numerous instances of possible solutions, and the longer you take in making a change for the better, the higher the percentage in Falcon Cove, Cove Beach will become. 30% is way too high. Please take this opportunity to be forward-thinking, to tackle this issue, put your names on it, and be proud that you are thinking of your fellow citizens. I firmly and heartily encourage the county commissioners to do all they can to create a task force and get some limitations on this issue before it becomes the downfall of the way of life for which my true neighbors bought in the area. I hereby volunteer to be on said task force. As a last note, I would like to state that Paul and I support the water board of our area. appreciate all they do, and we see the harassment they have had to put up with to hold their positions on a volunteer board. We firmly believe that they have worked in the best interests of all the neighborhood, and we will continue to support them. Thank you for your time. I appreciate your hard work. All right, and next up is Charles Dice.
Thank you, Gail. So I'm going to read from a letter that I sent in to the Board of Commissioners and to the county staff. This letter is in support of the proposed moratorium on short-term rental permits. One of the strategic objectives of the Board of Commissioners is affordable housing. At the 6/15/21 Clatsop County Board of Commissioners workshop, the board reviewed a study dated 2/26/21 by Angelo Planning that identified a number of potential sites in the northern part of the county where affordable housing complexes might be developed to provide affordable housing for Clatsop County workers and their families. Looking at the preliminary site plans for some of these complexes, it is clear that this project will involve many millions of dollars to develop. In the county's affordable housing study presented in January of 2019, and that's available on the county website, and I included a link to that. The following paragraph is found on page 5. Quote, "The growth of short-term rental activity, made easier by new website and app platforms, is likely exacerbating the perceived housing shortage and lack of affordability. While the Oregon coast has always had vacation rental activity, these technologies have facilitated the management of vacation housing for income generation. Investors seeking short-term rental properties likely bid up housing prices for local residents and also make it attractive to convert traditional rentals for year-round residents into short-term rentals for vacationers." Excuse me, end quote. This exact same conclusion has been noted in numerous similar reports done by or for counties and municipalities all across the country over the past several years as these communities deal with the issue of affordable housing. It is very clear that the rapid growth and lucrative business model for short-term rental properties is shifting thousands of properties away from actual or potential long-term rental to working families in favor of commercial units for affluent business investors. In my community of Cove Beach, over just the last few years, we have seen at least 2 homes transition from long-term rentals for local workers to short-term vacation rentals, and we have 1 home that is currently occupied by a local teacher and her family, where the property owner has already said that she plans to convert the property to a short-term rental. We've also seen several homes sell in our neighborhood as commercial business ventures to out-of-state owners or investors based on the financial projections on using the home as a short-term rental, with a newly purchased home being put into service as a short-term rental immediately. This is an especially troublesome trend for our small community, as homes are now being valued not just as a single-family home, but rather based on the large cash flows that can be realized from a short-term rental. These transactions are driving up the prices of homes in our community and truly closing out the possibility of homes being sold to workers or families or retirees for domestic use. These short-term rental properties in our community are achieving nightly rental rates of $500, $800, $1,000, and more. In parenthesis, just Google Cove Beach, Oregon vacation rentals and drill into the many, many offerings to find these summer season rates. This means that these STRs are only affordable for truly affluent clients or for very large groups where the enormous costs can be split over 10 or 14 or more people. If allowed to continue over time, our community will inevitably transition from a wonderful, quiet, peaceful, residential community to a beach resort of all short-term rental properties. Only 2 entities benefit from STRs in a residential neighborhood such as ours: the out-of-area property owner and the county from transient occupancy tax. There is no benefit to the established existing homeowners, only problems. We believe that there is a real and immediate opportunity for the county to consider substantial changes to its short-term rental program to encourage property owners to make these existing properties available to long-term renters as affordable housing. This could reduce the number of new affordable housing complex that the county is currently envisioning at a potential savings of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. Such changes in the short-term rental program or ordinance might include some best practices that are found in many other well-designed existing STR ordinances in other communities in Clatsop County, such as Astoria, Gearhart, Cannon Beach, Warrenton, excuse me, as well as many other communities and counties across the country. These best practices would include things like no STR permits in certain specific existing residential neighborhoods, no STR permits in land use zones where STRs are not a permitted use, limited number of rental periods, such as one rental every 14 days, or rentals limited to 30 days per year, limited number of rental units in each community or neighborhood as a percent of total number of homes. Number 5, limit total number of STRs allowed in the community. Number 6, limit STR permits to owner-occupied properties where the owner is in residence during any STR stay, also known as homestays, such as in Astoria. 7, no transfer of STR permits allowed. Number 8, STR permits could be matched to the provision of an affordable housing unit by that property owner on a one-for-one basis. And number 9, rotate STR permits with the availability of the same property as affordable housing. For instance, STR is a permit for 3 years, followed by use as affordable housing for 3 years, as an example. There are probably many more possibilities to develop good solutions to address the affordable housing problems using existing housing units. We believe a moratorium would provide the space for the county to study these possibilities and opportunities in much more detail to arrive at a more affordable, practical, and equitable solution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Charles. Next, we have written comment from Elise Shoup. Thank you for considering a moratorium on issuing new permits for short-term rentals while considering the impact of regulating them in Cove Beach, Falcon Cove. I was able to attend last week's meeting and I agree with the majority of the comments submitted. I do not, however, agree with Mr. Paparoni's request to keep water usage out of the equation because even though our water board has secured increased supply, clean water is not something to be taken for granted. Just ask our neighbors to the south in Garibaldi. Furthermore, we do not have a sewer system in Cove Beach, Falcon Cove, so all the water that is used becomes drainage for your drain field and beyond. We are in a coastal residential zone where commercial development is not allowed. According to Webster, commercial can be defined as having profit as a primary aim. Yet here we are with 30% to 32% of the homes in our area advertising for people to rent them, and there is not even a limit to the number of turnovers allowed. There is no commerce to support in our area. There is a quiet little ecosystem next to a pristine beach with increasingly limited access. Since we are not a state park, I do not wish for public parking, but improved access seems like a reasonable request for residents, visitors, and more importantly, law enforcement and emergency personnel. Thank you again for considering the limitation and improved regulation of short-term rentals. Okay. Next, we'll hear from Theo and Nancy Downs-Le Guin.
Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My wife and I have owned a vacation home in Cove Beach for about 16 years, and we recognize that owning a second home that we use only a few weeks out of the year without having to rent it out is a great privilege. We welcome neighbors who, in compliance with county regulations, use short-term rental as a way to maintain their property for their regular personal enjoyment, as well as the enjoyment of visitors. We are, however, concerned with the increase in owners whose goal, stated or not, is to produce income in excess of what is necessary to own and maintain their properties. These are de facto hospitality businesses operating in a residential community. Looking to communities ahead of us on that curve in Oregon and other Western states with more de facto businesses operating in Falcon Cove Beach, we can expect less willingness to engage in thorny civic process like this one, less and narrower infrastructure investment in spite of increased resource demands and usage, and a decrease in the diversity of those who have an ownership interest in the community. In short, commercial properties tend to make for self-interested and disengaged neighbors. During the moratorium period, we hope the county will work with citizens to review and put in place limits on rental nights and commercial usage that contravenes existing zoning, with the goal to limit density of de facto hospitality businesses operating in the community. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have written comment from Leslie Smith. My name is Leslie Smith, and my family has lived in the Cove for 13 years. I do hope that all the information gathered so far will be taken into consideration. I believe it is time for this moratorium to be put in place so that everyone who has a stake in the matter can sit down to discuss what is wrong and what is right with the permitting process and the rules and regulations. A task force or some type of committee needs to be formed so all those concerned can discuss what has gone wrong in a civilized manner and not an accusatory war of words. The short-term rental owners need to hear what goes on with the management companies, and their property and residents need to know the resident and their property and residents need to know the county will stand behind their rules and regulations. Thank you. Next, we will hear from Denise and Jeff Davis. And if they are not here, they did supply written comment, which I'll go ahead and read for them. As full-time residents in the Falcon Cove Beach community, we submit this letter in support of the proposed moratorium on short-term rental permits. We appreciate the opportunity to do so. After attending Public Town Hall number 1 on July 9th, we'd like to add some comments regarding one aspect of the STR issue. The more STRs in a neighborhood, the fewer homes are available for owner residents. Reference has already been made to the overwhelming imbalance with affordable housing that the high proportion of STRs creates. And with the significant transient population resulting from an unlimited number of STRs, and those STRs unconstrained by a minimum nightly stay, safety concerns arise in our community. With a preponderance of transient occupants, who looks out for neighbors by preventing and reporting crime? With a preponderance of transient occupants, who looks out for neighbors away from their homes by alerting them to damage, such as downed trees from strong windstorms? With a preponderance of transient occupants, who helps clear a driveway or a road of said downed trees? When a neighborhood is occupied by a network of residents who know their neighborhoods and care about their neighborhood, the community is better protected and thrives. Just yesterday, our long-term resident neighbor called us immediately after witnessing a theft on our property. The caring and watchful neighbor was able to describe the person who'd just stolen the objects, helping us to identify the person who took them. Because we too are residents who pay attention to the goings-on in our neighborhood, we have done the same for our neighbors when we observed suspicious activity. About 2 weeks ago, in fact, we stopped a theft in progress when a stranger was stealing fishing buoys from the property adjacent to ours. We were able to do this because we live here, observe the happenings in our neighborhood, and care about our neighbors. Would STR occupants have the same inclination or ability to help in this way? We haven't observed so. The growing number of STRs in Falcon Cove Beach will almost assuredly result in a community that is not as safe, for many reasons, than one that has a majority of neighbors who live here, know each other, and look out for the community. Because of this and the other reasons we've previously voiced, we'd like to reiterate our strongest support for immediate cessation of new STR permit issuance within our residential neighborhood, a limit to the number of different tenants allowed in any existing STR in a given time period, such as one in every 14-day period, as Cannon Beach is implemented, a cessation of renewals as permits expire, and improved monitoring of short-term rentals and more effective response to complaints about tenants. Thank you for providing us this opportunity to voice our sincere concerns in support of the proposed moratorium on short-term rental permits. Let's see. Next is Cameron LaFollette. Is Cameron here? Okay, I do not see Cameron. Is Rick Smith here? Okay, let's see. I read Leslie and Susan's comments. Carolyn Crawford?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And I wanted to just reiterate that times have changed. Everyone recognizes that. I bought my home in Falcon Cove 35 years ago, and I did so after visiting a rental in the area and falling in love with the place. I was welcomed 35 years ago by my neighbors and told about the history of the area. And it was a wonderful, diverse group of neighbors with a common respect and love for the Cove. Our water board at that time was the only local governing body. Everybody got together, everyone was welcome, everyone had a say, and we solved our differences amongst ourselves. Recent turnover in the last 4 or 5 years has eliminated the collegiality we once had and fully compromised our ability to work out our challenges amongst ourselves. And we have no more speaking rights at our water board meeting nor voting rights. There is a wary distrust permeating the Cove, and false accusations are rampant and far too frequent. And it's wasting valuable county resource time. On a bright note, though, as a result of this conflict here in the Cove, many of the short-term rental owners have gotten to know each other better. We put together the Good Neighbor policy, and we wanted to share our homes by welcoming visitors to our area for short stays. These visitors are all vetted, and in as much as we can control another person's activities, we do the best we can to make sure we have good visitors in our homes. We are committed to working together, and our rules are posted in my home, and I'm sure that they are posted in other homes concerning the safety, the environment, water conservation, evacuation plans and emergency procedures, and light pollution. Most of my guests, I believe, are doing a good job at that. I check with them during their stay to make sure that they have read those rules and are familiar with them. I want to be a good neighbor. I miss the impromptu gatherings and spirit of community that we used to have. Our efforts of good faith from SDR owners are largely ignored by a select few, and most of whom are relatively new to the Cove. Mostly unsubstantiated complaints are filed multiple times, and rather than being worked out together, are now burdened on the county. And I'm asking that the county strive to help us work together once more to become a unified community, without everyone losing the right to use their properties as they wish, as long as it does not impose on another property's use of theirs.
Short-term rental owners have made many efforts and proposals to work together, and our efforts are being ignored by a few. And we appreciate the fact that the county is giving us this opportunity and bringing it up. I ask for help in rebuilding mutual respect and thank you for the platform to have an equal and fair representation where all owners are treated equally. I believe this can be done with the help of the county, and we can once more achieve a common ground, equal representation between full-time residents, vacation homeowners, and those of us that allow visitors to come to our home. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Carolyn. Next, we have written comment from Beth Radich. Hello, my family lives in Falcon Cove. We have a young child, and I am a community volunteer. We are relatively recent residents, living here now the better part of a decade, and were warmly welcomed by the oldest families as well as the newest, and everyone in between. We love this community, which is why we take our time to volunteer here to keep it functioning, healthy, and safe. We immediately saw how much our neighbors give to this place we call home and pitched in, as we know it takes all of us. I would like to thank the Board of Commissioners and Planning Director for considering the construct that a moratorium on STRs can provide to address the multitude of known and documented issues arising from short-term rentals, particularly in a small, wholly residential community like Falcon Cove and the county's other rural communities. This community has recent experience in utilizing the helpful construct of a moratorium to address a critical issue. And while it can result in some loud criticism from a few people, in our community's case, it was brief, timely, and strongly supported by the vast majority, and the results from applying dedication and resources to address the issues resulted in a truly positive long-term outcome for the community. So what I am saying is, we empathize with the weight of your consideration and encourage you as leaders to dedicate yourselves to the goal of a lasting and sustainable solution. To re-emphasize my points, short-term rentals are commercial business activity, not residential. As concluded by several nearby communities, including some in Clatsop County, short-term rentals are in fact businesses and the transactions are commercial. Charging hundreds or thousands of dollars per night, filling business-related tax schedules for your property, transient lodging taxes, none of which come into our community. All of that is different and not residential. This is a residential community with no commercial zoning. Short-term rentals are not about sharing. It's possible to consider the homestay models that Astoria and Warrenton have moved to as a result of the serious and varied negative impacts to residents from short-term rentals as a sharing model, but certainly not taking residential housing supply and turning it into a profit center for out-of-towners. That is the opposite of sharing. Enforcement. Current short-term rental enforcement would greatly benefit from review and implementation of best practices. The real cost of short-term rentals must include adequate enforcement. While there is now a nominal violation reporting process, we continue to hear from neighbors and county staff about the variety of challenges they face around addressing violations in an effective way. That there is no staff at the busiest times, evenings and weekends, gravely limits the ability to proactively manage short-term rental violations and increases avoidable issues in a residential neighborhood. And we hear short-term rental owners blaming the messengers for using the county's reporting system. Again, this is an area that many local communities have already addressed and have best practices to model from. Availability of residential housing. Last week, I cited Oregon Public Broadcasting's recent piece titled "Vacation Rentals Are Exacerbating the Housing Crisis on the Oregon Coast," which references a quote from Clatsop County's own 2019 affordable housing study that really stands out and is something to consider during a moratorium. The growth of short-term rental activity, made easier by new website and app platforms, is likely exacerbating the perceived housing shortage and lack of affordability. While the Oregon coast has always had vacation rental activity, these technologies have facilitated the management of vacation housing for income generation. Investors seeking short-term rental properties likely bid up housing prices for local residents and also make it attractive to convert traditional rentals for year-round residents into short-term rentals for vacationers. As residents, we see and experience the impacts of the skyrocketing cost of homes here and the dearth of availability. We cringe when we see the real estate listings touting the vacation rental math, which essentially subsidizes non-residents to run businesses in residential neighborhoods, allowing generous tax breaks and a free beach house a couple of weeks a year. We also know it's one less house for a neighbor, a volunteer, a teacher, a county or a construction worker, a firefighter, or law enforcement officer. These are the fabric of a residential community, and we are losing them with each house sold to a more often than not wealthy and out-of-area investor. There is already an unsustainable number of short-term rentals located here in Arch Cape and Falcon Cove Beach. Within just a few miles, there are now about 100 STRs. More than a third of our small community is now in STRs, which nearly doubled within a few years. We did not move here to be surrounded by mini hotels. We moved to a coastal residential community where families live and visit, recreate, and work together. We did not move here to pay taxes that subsidize business owners and then have the county face a crisis to appropriate additional funds to build much needed housing when that supply already exists and it's simply being used for businesses instead of residences. Thankfully, there are numerous examples of nearby communities who have addressed these issues and found fair paths forward. I know we can do the same. Thank you for including our inputs and for considering the many positive examples of nearby leaders who have recognized the importance and value of residential communities. Okay, next, I know John and Maria Meyer had signed up to do in-person comments, but I know that we've also read comments from them. Are they here today? Okay, seeing none. Nate Tusing?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. Might apologize in advance if I feel a little sporadic. I didn't have a full speech prepared like a lot of people had. I guess one of the nice perks of being near the end is hearing all the different comments and seeing how everybody feels differently. I think a few topics that hit me pretty good is one, I do have a vacation rental, but it's also owner occupied. I planned on doing more, but with warrant and storage restrictions, that kind of put a cap on things. I've looked around the state and everyone's concerned thinking our vacation rental rules are too lax, but as I've researched around Oregon, it turns out Clatsop County and our cities are some of the most strictest in the state. And I think we have a kind of a battle between residents that have been here for a while, new migrants, of this change of the coast has become such a massive vacation destination. Clatsop County gets 1 million tourists every year. You know, growing up here in the 90s, that type of traffic didn't happen, but every year we seem to get more and more people. And we just have a serious lack of places for all these people to stay. We're trying to balance between remaining our cute little cozy coastal towns and balancing an economy that's based off tourism. You know, even if you look around to the hotels in the summertime, when people refer to these high costs of these vacation rentals, a lot of our hotels are charging upwards of $500 a night. So you see vacation rentals charging $500 a night, $1,000 a night. That's really not out of the realms of even what our hotels are charging, versus you're getting an entire house versus just one little room in a hotel. A lot of the other things I see is a lot of comments for Falcon Cove and Arch Cape, but this moratorium incorporates the entire county and whole. Places like Jeffers Garden, Lewis and Clark, which I don't feel like falls under the same type of narrative and issues. And I feel like if we start taking this approach of government going one size fits all for this shoe for everybody, it's going to become unfair for a lot of other areas that aren't affected by the impacts of Arch Cape and Falcon Cove. If you look on the county's records of short-term rentals, 50% of them are in Arch Cape and Falcon Cove, and the rest of them are spread out over the entire county. So you're talking an area of 10 square miles holding 50% of the short-term rentals for the whole county. So maybe doing a moratorium to address the issues faced by those towns would be appropriate, and rules specific to areas. But I'm afraid once we start getting into this process, moratorium and redoing rules, especially from my standpoint of wanting to add a short-term rental to my parents' property for their retirement, try and get them some extra retirement money for their make their life a little bit easier. This moratorium would affect that. So we're in the process of putting that together. We look at a 6-month stay. It makes you uneasy as someone who's about to spend $50,000 in an investment onto your property when you don't know what the rules will be when they come out of this, if it will be extended. And when you're looking at contractors' build times and having things lined out, a lot of those are a year out. So you push into a 6-month stay, not sure how that's going to come out. If it gets extended, then you're having to wait, put all that stuff on hold. It really makes someone nervous to put money into their property. Another point I think I'd like to address is, where's my note here? The common, I think, misleading narrative of affordable housing, thinking that, oh, if we just ban these short-term rentals, we'll have these homeowners, will turn them into long-term rentals, and we'll have rentals for people here long-term, and the prices will go down. But just in reality, that's just not true. When I bought my house a few years ago, I planned on turning it into a long-term rental, but the biggest driver was completely 100% eliminated that from ever being a possibility in my life or my mind ever again, is just the severely unfair laws towards landlords. I mean, if we really want to address the issues of of having long-term rentals in the county, I don't think short-term rentals are the blame. It really is the unfair practices against landlords. We just don't have any rights and protections. It's just, especially with the COVID, exacerbated that completely. But even before that, it became a huge issue with our legislature passing all these new rental laws. I have a lot of friends who did have rental properties, and when those laws became effect, all of them got out of the business. They all sold them. And the majority of the buyers that bought the houses were people moving here from California. So it's not so much even that the locals will even get to buy the houses. We have a massive influx into the state of a higher population, people moving from California and other places, because we do have a beautiful community. It is a beautiful area. People want to live here, and that also increases their driving prices. So I really think when people try and blame short-term rentals for these places of lack of long-term rentals, it's just misinformed and lack of actual research. I think you need to take a larger look at the whole picture and stop focusing on one little aspect of it. I think as far as maybe, kind of why I originally got into this was to oppose the moratorium, because it does affect other counties, and it seems like the biggest issue is just one community. So I can understand addressing the rules for those specific towns, but when you look on the county's website for our Airbnb rules as they are already, I think it's pretty well inclusive. It definitely covers health and safety. It covers a lot of the aspects. I think it's very well done. It's very extensive and complicated. I'm familiar with Bend, Deschutes County. Their vacation rental rules are so much simpler, so much easier. They're a lot more free. There's 880 vacation rentals just in Bend alone. Yet they all seem to manage to make things work without coming up with all sorts of dramatic issues. A lot of our zoning in Clatsop County is pretty restrictive and does restrict a lot of your options for short-term vacation rentals as well. So if we do put a moratorium, I think there is some room for improvement on relaxing what some people can do with their property, as far as maybe adding ADU units or adding tiny homes to their property that they could use as vacation rental, especially for our retired community, like my parents, trying to supplement their income with dramatically rising property taxes every year and being on a fixed income. So that's just kind of something to consider. And yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Nate. Okay, so we've got a few more written comments. I know that we're over our 12:30 time frame, but I do want to get these read, and then we'll go to the last slide and wrap up. Our next comment is from Amber Geiger Morgan. Thank you for reading my public statement in regards to short-term rental ordinance revisions that are proposing significant restrictions of vacation rentals. I'm deeply concerned that the proposed STR restrictions come from a place of exclusion, prioritizing those who can afford to own property along the Oregon coast or can afford a week-long stay. Did the visionary Governor Oswald West want just 5% of Oregon's population to have the exclusive use of its beaches, or did he want to keep Oregon's beaches accessible to all, not just the privileged few? As a Clatsop County taxpayer, short-term rental owner, and community member, I request the commissioners deeply consider policies that nourish a culture of excluding people just because they don't have the ability to live here full-time or afford a week-long stay. In a county that is 90% white, please consider how that impacts access for all Oregonians and the unintended consequences that will result. Potential issues with vacation rentals like noise, garbage, fires on beaches, parking, water usage, conservation are all things that we as a community can fix, but let's not use those as a reason to exclude others and limit access. My hope is that we can all come together as a community, open our hearts, and see the responsibility of the privilege we have as property owners and work together, keeping in mind both our smaller neighborhood communities and access for our greater community of Oregonians. Next comment is from Carol Harn. Thank you again, she's writing to the county commissioners. Thank you again for your service and your careful consideration about the contentious issue of short-term rental regulation. I appreciate this opportunity to give written testimony. It is my opinion that short-term rentals are unreasonably and unfairly being blamed for issues in the Cove that are issues that any neighborhood, with or without SDRs, naturally have to deal with. Some residents have made it their priority to exterminate all STRs in their neighborhoods and to do this at all cost, which includes falsifying incidents in order to increase the number and grandeur of complaints. We had a complaint lodged against our home a few months ago from the Water District when we were working on our garage. It was completely unsubstantiated, but could have delayed our permit process. These kinds of complaints logged into the county instead of directly contacting each other is problematic behavior that sets up walls and barriers between neighbors. Ironically, if you made it a priority to drive through Cove Beach 7 days a week for 6 months, I guarantee that you would see 99% of nothing. You'd see a peaceful, quiet beach community. Maybe you'd see a car parked illegally at a beach entrance once in a while. Maybe you'd see a short-term rental or full-time resident's trash can knocked over once in a while. Maybe you'd see some people walking their dog on the road, or you might see a gathering of people on a deck in the summer. But I guarantee you would be amazed at how serene it is. This is part of my astonishment. How did we get here? Because there were a few complaints? Were those complaints valid? Were they submitted by the same 1, 2, or 3 residents of the Cove? Please take this time, should you choose a moratorium on permits, to dive into the data. This is a good time to put the puzzle pieces together and to notice possible trends in the complaint activity. Opinions are important, but facts and data are what needs to drive policy change. Short-term rentals are a way of life all over the world, as they are a legal means for people to use their properties. Let's continue to dive deeply into how to make short-term rentals work best in our community and to set rules and standards for all community members, both STR owners as well as full-time resident owners. This is the most sound avenue to fairness and respect for all. I am hopeful for a time when we can all celebrate our beautiful community together with kindness driving our behaviors. Thank you for your time. Okay, our next comment is from Scott Harn. Thank you for creating this forum to provide my observations and comments. I'm writing to express my views on the merits of short-term rentals in our area and to plead to the Commission that when considering any policy change relative to claims of nuisance or damage, you must scrutinize the testimony, ignore everything that's unsubstantiated, misleading, or untrue, and be guided by reality, not emotion, hyperbole, and unsubstantiated allegations of devastating impact. When you do, you will be able to plainly see that there's nothing to see here, much ado about a trash can. Commissioners need to not be trapped into believing claims as true just because they've been stated. County needs to disassociate the cited nuisances that can't be explicitly linked to STR from consideration. Please hack through the noise on your own and apply a fair test to these claims of impact relative to a reasonable expectation of any residential area. I reside in the Portland Metro and my neighborhood is 0% short-term rentals. My neighbors make noise at night sometimes. They sometimes park in inconvenient places. Their trash lids are frequently not closed. I often see broken irrigation systems spouting water in the air. You can't complain about dog poop and poop bags. That happens everywhere and we all need to cope with it. Rereading the public comment, so much of this testimony is just intolerance for the tiny nuisances of everyday life. I can assure you that Cove Beach, with all its STRs, is far cleaner, safer, and quieter than my neighborhood with 0% STRs. Were the Cove actually a fully occupied residential area, the issues being surfaced would be much, much worse. Everyday nuisances do not form the basis for policy change, so why would they need to be illegalized here? Short-term rentals are already held to a higher standard than residents or long-term renters. We undergo a safety inspection. We pay incremental taxes, and the capacity of properties is strictly governed. Were I to rent my property as a long-term rental based on fair housing ordinances, I could make no occupancy demands of financially qualified tenants. A family of 10 could move into my 2-bedroom house and make a huge negative impact on the community with noise, traffic, vehicles, trash, and sewage. Furthermore, given the eviction moratorium, I couldn't do anything to get problematic long-term tenants out. At least with STRs, we actually validate party size and can decline parties that don't agree to our guidelines. Short-term rental opponents claim it's a residential neighborhood, but it's actually not. That's just a zoning label. The Cove was never developed as a full-time neighborhood and never has been a full-time residential area in actual practice. The foundation of the Cove is cheaply built, uninsulated cabin-style summer homes that have been known to collapse off unstable cliffs. Vacancy has been the norm here for years. If you divide the properties into cohorts based on their current use, full-time residents would be the smallest group. So let's please base our analysis on reality. What's happening here is the tiny vociferous group has let themselves become accustomed to conditions that no longer exist, and they're thrashing around to reject change that's happening on the coast. Short-term rentals are not to be blamed for changes in tourism happening globally, including the increase in popularity of Airbnb. Short-term rentals are not to be blamed for population growth in Portland and Seattle, which is placing increased pressure on our beaches. Short-term rentals are not to be blamed for the success of Oregon Coast tourism marketing campaigns, nor the pandemic, nor the increase in remote work that draws people to places like the Cove. Again, reading the public comment, there have been multiple references to having purchased in the 1970s and wanting to keep things the way they were. that is entirely understandable, but also entirely unrealistic and cannot be a legislative objective? Is it the role of local government to create artificial barriers to modern ways of life? The good of the neighborhood is being threatened by a few bad actors, namely those who confront and intimidate outsiders, those who use guerrilla tactics, post threatening signage in the public right-of-way, knowingly log false complaints, and create an unfriendly atmosphere. This behavior is no different than the surfer gangs in Seaside who seek to protect their waves with violence to outsiders. I encourage the County Commission to take advantage of the changing demographic and economic forces shaping the Northwest to benefit the county and not simply extend the locals only mentality of a generation ago. The Commission here has a great opportunity to demonstrate an enlightened and mature position reflecting the connected global world we live in and not kowtow to NIMBYs. Thank you. All right. Two more left, and they're pretty short. First one is from Ron Cox and Leslie Ann Butler. Regarding the proposed moratorium on short-term rentals in Falcon Cove, this entire discussion involving the lives of the members of the entire Falcon Cove community and the vital resources of the county boil down to a small list of false complaints emanating from a single individual that has single-handedly upset the order and cooperative spirit of the community. I ask that the board examine the facts in detail before imposing ordinances that punish those of us that have had no run-ins with this particular individual and that strive to promote civil interactions as neighbors. And our last comment is from Nancy Chase. Dear Commissioners, thank you for providing the opportunity to provide input regarding the proposed moratorium for short-term rentals. I own an STR in Falcon Cove, and I am in support of the moratorium. I believe the moratorium will allow time for county leaders and staff to research the issues and allegations regarding short-term rentals. When the STR issue was raised more than a year and a half ago, short-term rental owners and others in Falcon Cove committed to a good neighbor agreement to acknowledge what it means to be a good neighbor and implement improvements. In hindsight, I now realize that there is nothing short-term rental owners can do to make the opponents happy. The opponent's goal is to eliminate short-term rental units in Falcon Cove via the complaint process and misleading testimony. Opponents have orchestrated a perceived crisis demanding action from the county. I urge county leaders to take the time provided by the moratorium to research the facts so that any revisions to the STR ordinance are justified and in the best interest of the whole county. Number one, directly interview your code enforcement staff. What problems have they observed? How many complaints have been received in the last 2 years, and how many of the complaints are STR related? When investigated, were the complaints valid? If the STR complaints were justified, were the owners responsive, and did they work with staff on correcting the problem? Geographically, where did the complaints originate? What percentage of complaints are from a few people or related to a few STR units? What modifications, if any, would they recommend to the STR ordinance? Number two, direct county assessment and taxation staff to collect information regarding short-term rentals. Is there a significant increase in short-term rental units in the county? Year-to-year data should be collected by region in the county. Are these new STRs or pre-existing STRs just coming into compliance with the ordinance? Opponents of short-term rentals state that there are 30 short-term rentals in Falcon Cove. Is this true? Number three, county economy. Are short-term rental units important to the local economy? Do they provide a valuable housing choice for tourists? Do they provide jobs for service personnel and local management companies? I am sure there are other questions that need to be considered, and the moratorium provides time to answer these questions. In closing, I would like to point out that short-term rental units existed in Falcon Cove long before many of the opponents purchased their homes. I have rented my short-term rental to some of the opponents, allowing them to discover the beauty of Falcon Cove. It is sad they now want to make this a private community available only to a chosen few. Thank you for your time. And that concludes our comments. Is there anybody who's here who wanted to speak who has not yet had a chance to do so? Okay,
I would just point out there are some comments in the chat box. I don't know that everyone wants to stay longer to address them, but I noticed they were there and I hope they'll be part of the record as well.
Yes, they're very short, so I'll just read them in quickly. Claire Hazler Lewis said there is going to be friction in a community that is mostly residential and then disrupted by commercial use. This is a period of change for residential communities. However, in no case should community owners, residents have fewer rights than short-term renters. For instance, loud partying, drunkenness, trespassing, and parking. Scott Harn wrote that 30% estimated STR statistic, often repeated, includes the 10 units, approximately 10 units in Tillamook County. How can anything meaningful be implemented that isn't mirrored by their regulations? And Carolyn Crawford wrote, the percentage of STRs in Falcon Cove Beach is just 7%. The 30% may be countywide. Okay. So thank you everyone for your patience. I know that ran on longer than we anticipated. I also wanted to clarify, Chair Quila and Commissioner Bangs had previous appointments and weren't able to attend today's meeting. And Commissioner Webb is out of state visiting her daughter who is expecting their third grandchild. So that's very exciting. So on our next steps and coming up meeting dates, we're going to take the public comments that have been received at our 2 town halls, and we will package them up and send them to the board for an August 3rd workshop. That will be at 12 p.m. and that will give the board members an opportunity to review what the public input has been. Based on the outcome of that work session and the direction the board provides to staff, we are tentatively planning to bring forward the first hearing of the draft moratorium ordinance forward on August 11th. That meeting would be held at 6 p.m. And depending on the outcome at that meeting, a second hearing would be scheduled for August 25th, also at 6 p.m. And then if the ordinance is adopted at that meeting, it would go into effect on September 1st. And if the moratorium does go into effect, we'll be scheduling more town hall meetings to talk about the revisions to the ordinance at that point. Final thing, I forgot to change my date, but to all of our comments, our agenda package, the presentation slides are up on the county's website. Quickest way to get there is to ignore the mile-long link. Go to the county's webpage on the right-hand side to the calendar button. It'll bring up the July calendar. Click on today's meeting, and that will take you to all these documents. My email is on here as well. I think everybody in the entire south part of the county has my email now, but if you want my phone number, it's there as well. And again, just a reminder, our next work session with the board, August 3rd, 12 p.m. Before we leave, I'm going to ask Commissioner Toyoka and Commissioner Thompson if they have any closing remarks.
Commissioner Toyoka, can we hear you now? Sorry, well, thank you for being here. Friends, neighbors, colleagues, thank you so much for your good-hearted effort, your passion, your devotion to community well-being. We have some different ideas. If we focus on working well together, we can solve these. Thanks to everyone. Thank you, staff. Good job.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll see everyone on August 3rd.